Lastly, we're going to take a look at some additional wireless security protections that can be taken to secure home or even enterprise networks. These are kind of a miscellaneous list of extra things that you can do, and they take different approaches, may not translate directly to a piece of hardware or a piece of software, but are useful nevertheless. So number one is rogue access point system detection. This is finding those unauthorized access points that may have gotten added onto your network without your knowledge or your system administrator's knowledge. Number two, using the correct type of access point. It's always finding the right tool for the right job kind of thing. And number three is access point configuration settings. They have to be configured properly, otherwise they can be abused by hackers. We talked a little bit about this with home networks, for example, that hadn't been properly configured. And then the fourth one is wireless peripheral protection. Alright, so let's look at the first one, rogue AP discovery tools. There are 4 types of wireless probes that can monitor airways for traffic. There's a wireless device probe, a desktop probe, an access point probe, and a dedicated probe. Each of these attempts to find rogue access points that may have been connected to your network either permanently or temporarily. So what would this look like? Maybe you've actually seen this. Sometimes I've actually witnessed this in my former position with the Department of Defense. Inside the secure area, I would often see, well, not often, but on occasion, at irregular intervals, an system admin or some other security technician walking through an area with a handheld probe looking for Wi-Fi transmissions from unauthorized, or in this case, rogue access points. Or that even laptops can be configured to do this. So in the first case, a wireless device probe might be a portable laptop computer configured to act as a probe, scanning for wireless signals. Desktop probe. You can use a standard desktop PC where you plug in through the USB adapter a special device that monitors the RF frequency in that area for transmissions. There's also some AP vendors have included in their access points the ability to detect neighboring APs. And lastly, a dedicated probe, one that's been designed exclusively to look for such transmissions. So what do you do when you find one? Once a suspicious signal is detected by the wireless probe? Well, the technician who's going around doing this surveillance is not likely to take action immediately. No, the information is going to be sent to a centralized database where the wireless local area network management system software can actually see, is this legitimate or not first? And if it's not on the list, it would be considered a rogue access point. So let's talk about the types of access points. Remember, we said we've got to pick the right tool for the right job. Well, you want to match the needs of the network. So it falls into one of 3 categories or 3 types that you see here. Fat versus thin, controller versus standalone, and then something called a captive portal access point. So what do we mean by fat versus thin? Usually when we use those terms in information technology, we're talking about the level of sophistication required, the level of processing required, like in the case of fat client versus thin client. A thin client, for example, a thin client might be something like a simple Chromebook, which doesn't have much computing power on it, but is a thin client that's sufficient to surf the web and look at emails and draft emails. But in the case of an access point, an AP, autonomous APs, autonomous means able to act on its own without other authority. Autonomous APs have the intelligence in themselves needed to manage wireless authentication, encryption, and other functions for wireless devices. So they're fully automated, if you will. They're autonomous. These would be called FAT APs. They would fall into that category. On the flip side, we have lightweight APs. These would be the thin APs that don't have all that extra infrastructure loaded on them. They do not contain all the management and configuration functions that you would find in an autonomous AP. The other category type was standalone versus controller. Well, what's the difference here? Well, a controller AP can be managed. It can be controlled. through a dedicated wireless controller, or WLC. So what's a WLC, this so-called wireless LAN controller? It's a single device that can be configured, and then when that device is configured and it's properly set up and all the settings have been set, we don't have to replicate that for every device on the network. We can automatically distribute it to all the APs that are out there, all the controller APs. So it's kind of like the master-slave type situation where the WLC has the master set of settings and configurations, and then they're distributed or promulgated to all the subservient controller APs on the network. So what are the advantages of controller APs? Well, you can kind of guess what they are based on this description. There's a handoff procedure that's eliminated because now all authentications are performed by this master. It also offers tools that provide for monitoring the environment and providing information regarding best locations for APs, settings, and so forth. So here's an example of controller APs that's using this controller. So here you see the wireless LAN controller at the top of this slide. It's the single device that then can be configured, and then the settings and so forth are automatically distributed to all the controller APs. You see two right here, and these might be, a remote office wired LAN controller used to manage multiple wireless LAN controllers at remote sites from a central location. So there are several other advantages over standalone APs when you're using controller APs. You can think of this. As a wireless client device moves through, take one of these laptops and I start walking around, there's generally going to be a lengthy handoff procedure that would occur during which one standalone AP would have to transfer the authentication information from this guy to the next guy. So these slow handoffs would be unacceptable on most wireless LAN systems. If you had some kind of time-dependent communication, like you were looking at a streaming video, what a pain that would be as I'm walking from this zone to this zone to have to do an authentication. My video would stop. Maybe it's a VTC. I couldn't continue talking on the VTC because I'd have to stop for authentication. Well, with controller APs like you see here, the handoff procedure is eliminated because all authentications are performed here in the wireless controller, not at these subservient spots. All right, that takes us to captive portal APs. You've probably had experience with this if you go to the library and try to connect to their Wi-Fi, or you go to Starbucks and connect to their Wi-Fi. In each case, you're not immediately granted access to their wireless network. You're going to be presented with some kind of splash screen. Hotels is another example, as you see here, where you're going to be held captive, hence the name, for some period of time while you read and accept a user's policy or whatever it is that they want you to acknowledge before you're granted access. So it uses a standard web browser to provide information such as the acceptable use policy that you'd have to agree to, and maybe do some kind of authentication. So this gives the user the chance to agree to this policy and present credentials before accessing. So at a hotel, there's typically a hotel Wi-Fi that they give you before you can enter, and that's entered in on a captive portal AP. All right, let's talk about AP configuration and device options. Remember the example that we talked about where we have a home network that was unsecured and hence open to potential abuse and exploitation by hackers. So important to have a proper configuration. So what are the things that you want to consider here? Well, one thing is limit the spread of the wireless RF signal. That's key. You don't need a really high-powered RF signal if your signal only has to go within a couple rooms of your house. So that means you should set the minimum amount of signal that you need to get past the physical barriers of your enterprise. Maybe these are the walls in your house or the cubicles in your office space. How do you figure out what the best way is to do this? Well, you do a site survey. This is an in-depth examination and analysis of a LAN site to figure out what those propagation paths are and how much power you need to project through every place where you want to be able to receive that signal legitimately. So these are the signal strength settings. Some access points do allow you to set that power level. Right? Is it going to be 100 megawatts? No way. Right? It's going to be much, much lower power. So reducing the power allows less signal to reach outsiders. So spectrum solution is another, or selection, excuse me, is another way. This is figuring out what the appropriate frequency band is in channels. In the old days, you might remember that if you had certain wireless devices in your home for perhaps changing the channel on your television set, sometimes, or even wireless phones, early wireless phones, you'd see this, where there'd be multiple channels that you would select via a toggle switch. If one channel had too much interference, you could switch to an alternate channel to allow you to communicate on that channel. This is known as channel selection, and this persists to this day with some access points that allow you to find a more favorable channel in which to propagate your Wi-Fi signals. Also, the frequency band and channel width. The placement of the antenna is another key thing. Where do you put your antenna? Now that most of us are in our homes connecting via Zoom meetings or some other wireless or other technology, the placement of our router antenna is critical to make sure that we can see that signal throughout our house. Usually, you want to place it near the center because this signal is generated omnidirectionally in every direction. So the best place to put it would be in the middle of your house on a middle floor rather than in the basement, in the utility room, next to the dishwasher, or next to the washer or dryer, for example. So you want to put it in a place where there are as few signal obstructions as possible. If it's an enterprise, then you probably put it on the wall or on the ceiling, and that's what you see like at HCC when you look in our classrooms and labs. You'll see the Wi-Fi transmitters are located in the middle of the ceiling generally, and that also deters theft. So, if possible, as it says here, you don't want to put it on the perimeter. You don't see many any access points or wireless transmitters located in entranceways, for example. That would not be a wise choice. Also, we have wireless peripheral protection. What is this about? This is vulnerabilities in wireless mice and keyboards. So those are known as peripherals, mice and keyboards. So one attack could let a threat actor inject mouse movements or keystrokes from a nearby antenna up to 100 yards away. So how do you protect against this? Well, you would need to update and replace any vulnerable devices and switch to properly tested or fully tested Bluetooth mice and keyboards that wouldn't have this vulnerability. And instead of using a wireless mouse or wireless keyboard, you could avoid the whole thing just by using a wired connection. So here's our summary for this chapter. We talked about, we had three objectives here. We were looking at wireless technologies and the attacks that are associated with them. So we looked at Bluetooth, we looked at near-field communications, we looked at RFID and how those technologies can be abused and how to protect them. We also looked at the IEEE 802.11 specification and its vulnerabilities and looked at the progression over time and what security precautions were put in place as these were uncovered in the weaker versions of the standard. We talked about rogue APs, we talked about evil twins, we talked about how to guard against them now that we have blurred networks. We also talked about the Wi-Fi protected access and Wi-Fi protected access 2, which have become the foundations of wireless security today, and the use of temporal key and code chaining, and also the extensible authentication protocol EAP framework for doing authentication. Lastly, in this last screencast, we looked at the other steps to protect a wireless network, which would include taking steps to find and root out those rogue access points, how to find the best type of AP to match the needs of the network, how to use these wireless LAN controllers to manage access points in your enterprise, the use of captive portal APs, and how to do the physical adjustments necessary for an access point. This would include lowering the power to the minimum needed to accomplish the task, as well as positioning your antenna in the most optimal location to support propagation. So that concludes the discussion. I would hope that you have a chance to go through and read everything in this chapter, and particularly the notes that are provided in the note boxes, which provide amplifying information and examples. Like I said, I would like you to take a look at the Amazon Go store and the near field communication videos that I'm also attaching to this page in Canvas. And we'll also have a discussion group discussing how Amazon Go might work, some of the advantages and disadvantages of using it. And again, if you have any questions between now and our office hours on Thursday night, feel free to send me a Canvas message. Thank you.